second scripture today is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 61, verses 1 to 4. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. They will be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord to display his glory. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. That phrase, the year of the Lord's favor, is a loaded phrase in the Bible. It refers back to an Old Testament law. Now, normally, talk about Old Testament laws, and especially we modern Christians think, we just leave that stuff alone. This one is particularly fascinating because it is as foreign to us as it could possibly be. The law that year of the Lord's favor refers back to is the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee. And it's a phrase that everyone that heard Isaiah say this, everyone who read this passage historically would have known exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about the year of Jubilee. Well, what is that? It is based on the Sabbath, and it is essentially the Sabbath of the Sabbath years. So every 50 years, they had a year of Jubilee, or they were supposed to have a year of Jubilee. And it was the Sabbath for all of creation. It was a complete leveling of everything. To bring everything back to start again as if from scratch. Debts were canceled. Slaves were set free. Prisoners were set free. Now, the only time you were in prison in those days, you didn't go to prison for stealing or for killing somebody, for any of those things. That had a rather radical and momentary punishment for it, and it was over. The only thing you went to prison for was debt. And again, so if you're a prisoner, you're set free. You're no longer in debt. The land all went back to the original families of ownership. When the nation of Israel was first founded, when the Hebrew people got there after traveling and came to the promised land, they parceled the land out to all of the families. The year of Jubilee, it all went back to whatever family had that property originally. The good or bad luck of your parents or grandparents no longer impacted you. Their hard work or their laziness didn't determine your future. Their choices were no longer yours. Their sin or their righteousness all wiped away. Everything was a clean slate. Everything was a clean slate. Now, when the first law was formed back in the Leviticus days, back there when they first wrote about this year of Jubilee, they were picturing, how do we structure a new society that reflects God's yearnings for all of us? And they pictured this necessity. If people were to have hope, every now and again, everything had to be made level again. If people are going to have opportunity, every now and again, everything needs to be wiped clean. And so they had this law. God provided them this rule for every 50 years. Imagine instituting that in our society. I couldn't help but think about Roy Moore arguing for biblical principles, wondering, are you going to argue for a year of Jubilee? All of the economic foundations of capitalism would be gone. All of them. all of us would be somewhere else. I'd be back in Scotland. We'd all be somewhere else because this land wouldn't even belong to the Chumash. It would belong to whoever was before them. No credit, no mortgages, capitalism itself wiped away. There would be no more trust fund babies sitting down at 10 a.m. on State Street drinking a martini. There would be no generational poverty. There would be no white privilege. There would be no systemic racism. Power and resources would no longer be concentrated in the hands of a few families. Everything, every 50 years, back to square one. Those who complain about the estate tax as a redistribution of wealth, that's just child's play compared to the biblical law of the year of Jubilee, where everything gets redistributed every 50 years. Except it wasn't. From what any scholars can see, never once was the year of Jubilee observed. And we all know why. Because the only people who could make it happen were the people who were in power. And by the time 50 years came along, they thought, you know what, I like having this power, and I've worked so hard for this, and I've earned this, and I want to pass it on to my children or my grandchildren, and I want to make sure they have an easier life than I did. And besides that, those people over there, they're lazy, and they're shiftless, and they're sinners, and they don't deserve it. But I do. And God didn't really mean for this to happen anyway. Because if God had meant this to happen, then I wouldn't be so wealthy right now. 50 years came and went. And that idealistic, crazy idea that was in the Old Testament to redistribute wealth so that everyone was equal, well, they just ignored it. But it remained God's dream. And it fascinates me that it was crazy enough, important enough, that even though the power people didn't like it, it still stayed in the Bible. They could have erased it, you know. But there were enough folk who said, no, this is what God really wanted. We're going to keep this idea here, just in case. And every now and again, it comes bubbling up to the top. And that's what happens with Isaiah. This is centuries after it was first envisioned, after it was first written down. And Isaiah is looking at the people in exile in Babylon. It's a very different situation than the original folk. They were building a society. These folk had lost a society, but he knew they needed hope. They needed to know that God yearned for something wonderful for them. And so Isaiah picks up and he says, God has anointed me to preach the year of Jubilee. And all these folk whose hearts had been broken, all these folk who had lost everything, all of these folk said, oh, if only this would come into being. If only once again God's yearnings would be filled full. There they were on the margins, living in exile in Babylon. And the prophet stands up and says, God has a better idea. God has a better idea. Everything redistributed. And he preached it. Jesus picks it up too. Centuries after Isaiah. The first words that Jesus says are these words. He reads the passage from Isaiah in the synagogue, and he sits down. They preached sitting down. And says, today, these words are about me. These words are about me. Jubilee is why I am here. Now, his situation was similar to that of the exiles that Isaiah spoke to, because his audience were people who were living underneath the Roman occupation. So they were the same kind of marginalized, but again, completely different than what the original audience was. Now, Christians read these words from Jesus and we forget the context of it and we forget what it really meant and we kind of spiritualize it. And there's room for that. There's room for that. There certainly is a piece of it that can be spiritualized. But whenever we read these words, we cannot ignore the economic and the political implications because they're real. They're very real. Jesus sat there and preached and said, I have been sent to proclaim God's yearnings for a new world order. And it is a new world order that has freedom for all people, that has opportunity for everyone, that has equality for everyone, where nobody gets handicapped, where nobody gets to start the race halfway to the end, where nobody sits on third base and says, I hit a triple, when they really didn't. They were just born with it. No one gets to say, well, my father just gave me a small loan of $1 million to start my first business. But instead, every 50 years, everything gets started again. Well, I don't know that Jesus intended that every 50 years everything would start again, but certainly the principles of that he intended. That we have a just society for all people. Now, you all know that I choose my passages months in advance. And I struggled this week with this one. I think I wrote 3 sermons yesterday. And I didn't finish until 9:30. You can judge whether or not I really finished it or not, or if I should have gone back and tried again. Last Sunday I talked about, again from Isaiah, about the need for tender words these days. Well, if we needed tender words last week, we certainly needed good news this week even more. Last Sunday the fire was terrible. Doesn't look bad right now, but we know what's happened since last week. And we all have friends or family members who have been evacuated. We've all friends and family members who've left town voluntarily to try to escape the constant anxiety and the terrible air quality, all the while knowing that they're sitting there wondering what's going on back home. We have a nursery school teacher whose family has a family farm, family ranch outside of Carp, and they lost 2 houses. Her grandmother's house burned down, and a house that was lived in by one of their ranch hands and his family. We all know those stories. We all know those stories. And we also know that even in disaster, people who have resources fare better than those who don't. We read of a tax plan. Notice I said we read of a tax plan because nobody's actually read it yet. Rushed through without any real discussion or negotiation, with only one thing about it that seems to me to be incredibly clear, and that is that if you could write a tax bill that is the opposite of the year of Jubilee, they're doing it. It's almost like they picked it up and said, how can we do something that makes this not possible? The internet has been effectively sold to the highest bidders. And the one thing most important in modern society, information has been commodified. If you pay enough, we'll make sure your information gets out there. Nominees for lifetime appointments to the federal judiciary put forth having received unanimous ratings from the committee that does this for the National Bar Association. Unanimous ratings that they're not qualified. Some of them never even having been in a courtroom. This week I watched a video of Puerto Rico. How long has it been since the hurricane there? Folk still waiting for running water, still waiting for electricity, still waiting for a sense that, hey, at least we recognize that you're part of us. And instead, none of that's happening. The list goes on. We could use good news today, couldn't we? I'm really good at bad news. And we hear all of that stuff. I hear all of that stuff. You can speak for yourself. And I feel it in my gut. And unfortunately, it's been more than a year that my gut has been like this every day. And every day, I wonder if it can get worse. And then it does. And some crazy person way back in the history of Israel heard God's yearnings for a society where things work for everyone. And it didn't happen. But the vision didn't go away. And then Isaiah picks it up and he says, you know what? God wants just that. Still. And God's committed to it. And it still didn't happen. And Jesus comes along and he says, guess what? God sent me to work on this yet again, and it still hasn't happened. And we read the words today. We read these same words every 3 years in the lectionary. And the words come to us, and the first way they come are as good news. And we need good news. I need good news. And the good news is that God still has a dream for us. And God still envisions a world. That God is not satisfied with the status quo. God is not satisfied. That God's yearnings for a world that is both more human and more humane are still there, and God is still waiting and working and hoping, and God is committed to seeing that come about. And not just for those of us here. In a lot of ways, you know, we're the ones for whom Jubilee would be bad news. But the good news is still there. That yearning for a world of shalom. Now the other piece of it is, or along with that, is that we've tasted some of that. We've tasted some of that. We know what it feels like to be part of a community where we are loved and supported and cared for. We know what it's like to sit here and look around and you know, the world says that as homogeneous as we are, that under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be a group that would necessarily get together. But we do, because God has broken down barriers. And we see it beyond that. We know that we have sisters and brothers who speak other languages, who live in radically different ways than we do, who are different than us in any way that you can imagine. And yet, we feel that kinship. We have tasted something of that amazing vision that God has. We're part of a congregation where we have opportunities to make a difference. Sometimes they're small ones. That food is going to go to the Unity shop and it'll be gone like that. Those presents that the kids get at the Unity shop, half of them will be broken before January's over. But at least for a few days, it will have made a difference in someone's life. And we can do that. We're part of a congregation that pushes us to be more of what we should be. We're not a perfect church by any stretch of the imagination. I don't know what that would look like. And I'm supposed to. But we've tasted it. And you know, we've tasted it in a broader way than that. We live in a country where, at the very least, we hold a vision of what we're supposed to be that gets awfully close to that vision of shalom. I can't help, as I was reading this, but think of Martin's word that what about a community, a country where we are judged not by the color of our skin, but by the character, by our character. And I think of that and, oh yes, of course. And then I read the words on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, send me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And I think that's what God is talking about. And we own those things. We own them as a people. We've tasted it. And we live in a country where we have the potential to make a difference. We can vote. And it counts. I was watching the election results in Alabama. And they were talking about a previous election there that was decided by 193 votes. It was a primary because, of course, we know that up until this time, Democrats didn't ever get elected in Alabama. But a primary where it was decided by 193 votes. Heck, we can make a difference. We can make a difference. And you and I, we have resources. We can help change the world. We can speak and people listen to us. Heck, who knows? Maybe 1,000 people will hear this sermon next week on YouTube and they will go, yes! Why are you laughing? We can resist those pushes to make the world less than what it should be and act to make it more. And while we are receivers of that good news, we are also bearers of it. Isaiah reframed those words and reiterated them for his community. Jesus spoke those words again and saw them as his call, and indeed it is our call too. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon you. The Spirit of the Lord is upon us to speak words of jubilee. To speak that this year, indeed every year, is the year of the Lord's favor if only we work for it. There's a wonderful theological concept in Judaism, tikkun olam. It basically means, it translates as repair the world. And they know, they've got this theological insight that says the only way the world gets repaired is if we work in partnership with God. That God can't do it alone. You know, the old joke of the wonderful garden, and the pastor's walking by and sees the person working in the garden and says, that's a beautiful garden that you and God have. And he responds, yeah, you should have seen it when God had it by himself. And it's true. It's true. The only way the world gets repaired is if our hands get dirty and if we work at it. The prophets remind us again and again that speaking the word is never enough. It always has to be worked out and acted upon. And so, you and I, as recipients of the good news of Jubilee, are also called to use our freedom, to use our resources, to use our influence, to work, to make the Jubilee